From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, arms sales, a useful foreign policy tool?
An examination of arms sales, or arms transfers, if you will, as a tool of foreign policy, must inevitably recognize the potential of such sales to affect the economic, military, psychological, as well as the diplomatic posture of the recipients. More, in each of these areas, the recipient's posture plays a part, large or small, but always important, in the grand design of U.S. policy to protect crucial American interests and those of our allies in Western Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and South America. Our discussion of arms sales, to be sure, is concerned solely with conventional arms, not atomic weapons, but a vital factor is the extraordinary sophistication which has developed in conventional arms in this electronic era, and the potential hazards to our own overall security if these sophisticated elements are in the hands of nations whose borders lie in the volatile areas of confrontation between the interests of the United States and her allies and the Soviet Union. In mid-1981, the Reagan administration announced its arms transfer policy, emphasizing that the, quote, basic thrust is to recognize that arms transfers properly considered and employed represent an indispensable instrument of American policy that both complements and supplements the role of our own military forces, end quote. This is a marked change of direction from Carter administration policy emphasizing restraint and primary consideration of a recipient's human rights policies in approving arms sales. Well, to examine the question mark on our arms sales issue, we have a highly expert panel. To my far right, Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, a West Point graduate who holds a doctorate in international relations from Columbia University, served with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and after retiring from the service was Assistant to President Ford for National Security Affairs. To my immediate right, Representative William L. Dickinson, Republican from Alabama, and ranking minority member of the House Armed Services Committee and Subcommittee on Research and Development. To my immediate left, Senator Joseph R. Biden of Delaware, member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Biden served as chairman of the U.S. Senate delegations on SALT II in Moscow and to the North Atlantic Assembly in Ottawa in 1979. To my far left, Representative Les Aspin, sixth-term Democrat from Wisconsin with a doctorate in economics from MIT. Dr. Aspin earlier served as an economist with the Pentagon, and now is a member of the Armed Services and Budget Committees of the House. Well, to begin, gentlemen, I would pose the same question to each of you in turn. To what extent should an arms transfer or sales program play a role in our foreign policy? Senator Biden.
Well, it seems to me that we have an expression, those of us who practice law before coming to the Congress, that hard cases make bad law. And I think it's very difficult to make sweeping statements and generalities about arms control policy, but to the extent that one must be made, it seems to me that the U.S. Should have a be both restrained and prudent in making arms transfers and arms sales, while at the same time recognizing that in particular circumstances they can be very vital and important to U.S. interest. There are instances where arms transfers are, in fact, absolutely essential for U.S. interest, and others where we have made bad or incorrect judgments about the stability of the nations to whom we are transferring their arms, and failed in other instances to factor in the arms transfer as part of the overall foreign policy determination for a region or a country. So it's sort of a mixed bag. I think it's neither indispensable, as this administration says, nor should it have been an exceptional tool of foreign policy, as the last administration indicated.
Representative Dickinson.
I agree in the main with what the Senator said. whether we like it or not, it is an instrument of foreign policy, and you cannot escape it. That being so, the best thing we can do, and what we should do, is to use it, as Senator Biden said, in a very prudent manner. But whether we're talking about our friends and allies or potential adversaries, we are going to have to influence our foreign policy with the use of weapon sales, just as the Soviets do, just as the French do. And I don't advocate an arms race, but to say that it is not an instrument of it is to ignore the obvious.
Representative Aspin?
I agree. I think that there's no question that it is an instrument, whether we like it or not. There it is. What makes it so difficult is that there is an ethical and a moral dimension to arms sales, as well as a national security dimension. It's not unlike human rights in that way. It's a complicated issue where you've got ethics and morality competing with national security considerations, which means, I think, two things. Number one, it's very difficult to take an extreme position, either totally for arms sales or totally against. And secondly, it's very, very difficult to be totally consistent. You may find two similar cases. In one case you want to sell arms, in another case you don't. All in all, it's a very difficult subject to deal with.
General Scowcroft.
I think it's a rather important as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. After all, there are relatively few such instruments that we have. We have diplomatic policy, economic aid, and arms transfers, if you will. Arms transfers are unique in the sense that, whether we like it or not, the world in which we live is one in which power is a primal element. And where that is the case, insecurity is also an important element. And arms sales, in addition to U.S. military policy itself, U.S. military guarantees and so on, serves an indispensable role in lessening the kind of insecurity that the world in which we live in produces.
Right, we're examining a change in direction in arms transfer policy. President Carter launched a restraint policy, a unilateral effort to reduce arms transfers to the third world with a multi-billion-dollar ceiling, but a set of guidelines, hopefully setting a good example to other arms suppliers. And he also had a multilateral effort launched in discussions with European nations and formal negotiations with the Soviet Union. Even earlier, the Congress had restricted arms transfers and assistance personnel by numbers, by control of credit, by the nature of the recipient regimes, etc. But both of these efforts, it seems, bore little fruit. What went wrong? General Scowcroft, would you start?
Well, I think they bore little fruit because I think they were well-meaning but fundamentally misguided. And that is, they operated on the premise, the simple and in many ways comforting premise, that arms create wars, and that therefore it's intrinsically an evil and should be engaged in only when our overriding national interests are involved. And it seems to me that fundamentally misses the point. You know, long before there were complicated weapon systems, long before there was gunpowder, there was war. Conflict is older than recorded history, and it's deeply rooted in the nature of man. And it seems to me that arms and arms races really represent the thermometer, not the disease, and that we're not likely to cure the disease by breaking the thermometer. Now, I think certainly a lot of our friends use arms or want arms for purposes we do not consider overriding. Nevertheless, ought we really to set ourselves up as the judge of the fundamental national interests of our friends? And it seems to me that the answer to that question is fundamentally what was wrong with the policy of the previous administration.
If I may, I think I disagree with the General, at least to some degree. I would suggest that the real issue is not whether or not nations, in effect, would fight anyway. And I think the General's correct. I mean, whether or not they had SAM missiles provided by the Soviet Union, or whether or not they had sophisticated airplanes supplied by the United States or France. If they didn't have those, they'd use slingshots or rocks or bow and arrows or whatever. But I do think U.S. national interest is impacted upon significantly depending on the degree to which of sophistication of the weaponry. For example, it is much less likely that a conflict that is limited to obsolete tanks and old M1 rifles or their counterparts or Remington rifles is going to embroil a whole region of the world and in fact bring the United States into a confrontation it would otherwise like to avoid, thereby either bringing in the Soviets or the Soviets first, making it a East-West confrontation. I think that the extent to which that occurs, at least in some part, depends upon the degree of sophistication of the weapons. The reason why the Congress got in the business of saying that we want to have at least a say in that, because it is a component of foreign policy, was because it went from $1.7 billion to somewhere in the order of $16 billion in a matter of 4 years. And it looked as though, to some of us, that it was becoming almost the sole criteria for determining what reach we would have abroad. And I am much more Machiavellian, I guess, than my friend the General. And in fact, I do think if we are transferring arms, we should first and foremost conclude whether or not it impacts favorably on our national interest. If it does, and yet it does not impact on their interest, I would vote to send the arms. If it does not, yet it does favorably impact on them, I would be inclined not to send the arms. That's an oversimplification. And last point in regard to transfers, there are two elements of the transfers. We compete not only with our Soviet friends, they are our enemy, they are in fact engaged in confrontation in various levels and stages throughout the world, and we are engaged with them. But we are also engaged with our allies. And it seems to me that one of the things we have missed, and one of the things is chairing the European Committee for some years now in the Senate, is that we are somewhat timid about speaking to our allies firmly about what the quid pro quo for them doing such and such is. And so we tend to say, we say we are as helpless in dealing with French sales, which may be true, British sales, or any other ally, as we are with Soviet sales of third world countries. And I think we should at some point, at least in the Congress, address whether or not we have been tough enough where we can be tough.
Let me agree with some of what General Scowcroft said and some of what Senator Biden said. I think that it's true that arms do not create the conflict. The conflict was there before the arms, that the conflict will go on whether we provide the arms or not, that who are we to judge their national security interests? They have to look at their own national security interests. But it's our decision as to whether we are to sell them a particular weapon or weapon system. And I think that given the limited leverage implied by your statement, which I agree with, that we have limited leverage, even if we provide them the arms, that we had better make pretty sure that their national security interests, at least in the use of that weapon, is consistent with ours.
Congressman Dickinson?
Well, I don't know that I can add much to this particular point, except to underscore the fact that we do sell arms should be to promote our national interests, not to help that country necessarily. If by helping that country we promote our interests, yes. But then getting back to Les's point, I don't know that we can properly put ourselves in the role of judge and say, well, we don't believe that this is in your national interest, so country of Chile, we won't sell you a sophisticated airplane, so they go and buy a Mirage from France. Or we say to South Africa, we don't like your internal politics, we need you strategically, we need your minerals, but we won't sell you a submarine. So what do? They go to France and buy submarines. We haven't denied anything except we have put a strain on relationship, and maybe to the point of breach at some times. But you see, when you talk about weapons sales, that's just a part of it. And there is a pending deal now with Saudi Arabia for about $8.5 billion. Well, if you break that down, only about $2 billion, 2 to 3, is actually for weapons. The rest of it is going into hospitals, it goes into the infrastructure, it goes to train people. Their people come over here, we go over there, there's a cultural exchange. And so there's a very large ripple effect, and I just picked Saudi because they have the largest pending sale now. But in countries around the world, all of these ripple effects are very important to us. And so we have to look at what is our national interest, and it's very difficult to say, well, we won't sell it to you, and then force them to go someplace else.
General, you want?
Yeah, well, I think it goes without saying, Senator, that our national interest is what we're concerned about, not the national interest of the recipient. But presumably, our national interest is involved in making them feel more secure for some purpose that we have in mind. And it's that I meant when we say, you don't really need those things. Right. We want to help you, we're your friend, but you don't really need those weapons. And it's that I think gets over to the point that Congressman Dickinson had.
Two brief points with regard to that. First of all, it seems to me that a point that Congressman Dickinson just made, take South Africa for an example. The implication is because South Africa went to an ally, France, or will go to an ally, France, to get the same thing we wouldn't sell them, that somehow that doesn't benefit us particularly. Let me suggest that may be of immense benefit to us. Let's assume that one of the downsides, I think we'll all agree, potential downside, doesn't always occur, but one of the downsides when it occurs of an arms transfer to another country may very well be that we feel we have to, because of security reasons, give aid, military aid, but we know we're going to suffer a propaganda price for having done so. So I would suggest that in a sophisticated arms transfer policy, and I realize I'm coming off as the young prince here of Machiavelli, but I would suggest that sometimes it makes sense for us to forego the downside, which is the propaganda loss as a consequence of a transfer to what we would acknowledge as a regime that doesn't particularly have values compatible with what we view ours to be, and yet accomplish the same goal by having an ally move and fill that vacuum. Second point is that with regard to the question of insecurities of foreign countries, I think one of the problems that we sometimes face, Democratic and Republican administrations, has been that we fuel the insecurities of insecure leaders. We give them a false sense of security by the transfer of arms. I can think of no greater case in point than Iran. I can think of no instance in recent history, frankly, the history of the United States of America, in transfer of arms where we, in fact, kidded ourselves and allowed the Shah to kid himself. Here we had close to $30 billion worth of the most sophisticated arms in the world, and not a shot was fired. Not a single shot that I'm aware of. He was marched out of the country, his successor was marched out of the country, and all those weapons are either lying dormant or have been accessed by the KGB in the Soviet Union, and/or are being prepared to be used in a way, if they ever get their act together, that may be inimical to our interest. We're now told, with regard to Saudi Arabia, the reason why we should sell them certain weapons, including AWACS, is because there's a runway in Iran, and Iran has those well, I won't go through all the weaponry, but Iran has those weapons that can take off, be across the Gulf in a matter of minutes, and now we have to supply a nation with sophisticated weaponry to shoot down the sophisticated weaponry we gave an insecure leader who we should have known we were just feeding his insecurity if we had been willing to look beyond our own intelligence apparatus, training of their intelligence apparatus through whom we got the advice. That's an overstatement, I'm afraid, but that's the tendency of senators.
It's very interesting. General, would you like to
Yes,
take on?
I think it's a substantial overstatement. And it seems to me that recent events in Iran, if they've shown anything, it's that the situation with the Shah is far more complicated than it appeared at the time. In 1971, when the British pulled out of the Gulf, we had three ways to go. We could try to keep them there and subsidize them. We could replace them with our own forces, or we could try to create a bastion of strength there.
Agreed.
We chose the third. Now, I suggest that it was highly successful, and that while the Shah was there, the Gulf was stable. There wasn't a war between Iran and Iraq. It didn't cost us anything. As a matter of fact, economically, it benefited us. I think it's a moot point how much it did or did not have to do with the Shah's fall. But afterwards, what have we had to replace the Shah with? 2 carrier task forces, an RDF that we're trying to fund, billions of dollars that is going to cost the United States to replace what we had in the Shah.
I don't disagree that we
May I
should-
just throw in RDF being a rapid deployment,
Rapid
force. What are the hazards of having sophisticated weaponry of the kind that we did transfer?
May I make-
And I think the fundamental question is, was all of that weapons that we sold to the Shah necessary to play the role that General Scowcroft is saying that we wanted the Shah to play? I think that the point is correct, that we were looking for a substitute for the Brits. We were looking for somebody to provide some stability to the area. But does that mean F-14s, DD-963 destroyers? I mean, does the whole baggage have to come with that? And my answer to that would be no. I mean, there's a role to play. There was and arms sales would have been part of it. But all of these extremely sophisticated weapons, I think you could argue that it made his military force less effective than it might have been. It stretched their technology, their technical people very, very thin. We never know, because of course the Shah's army and air force and navy was never put to the test. It crumbled from within rather than was defeated from out. And so we never know. But I think that you don't have to sell them everything to follow the policy that you're advocating.
I wouldn't disagree with that, and I think reasonable people can disagree over weapon system by weapon system.
Well, now, Representative Dickinson raised very briefly an issue that became a cause célèbre, the Saudi Arabian purchase, which included the AWACS. This is an area in which we are caught between the nether and the near millstone. It's almost impossible to come out of it without making somebody upset at us. Is this an area that is so common and constant in this field that we really should shrink from the whole arms transfer business as much as possible because of the problems they can raise?
I think there's one thing that's part of this, is that there's maybe an asymmetry here, that you don't get much from selling it, but you might get hurt a lot if you announce that you're going to thinking about selling it and then deny the sale.
There's a lot of truth in that.
I think that's part of the arms sale problem, is this asymmetry. That by selling it, we may get a little bit of leverage, we may get some goodwill, we may gain a little bit, but the downside, if you don't sell it, turns out to be enormous with these countries. I mean, they take it as a personal affront and a rejection, and I think that's what gets us into trouble, is that we make these deliberations in public, as you do, but if the decision turns out negative, it can have severe consequences.
I don't disagree with that, but I would like to add one point about Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia falls into the category that I arbitrarily said I thought there were 2 categories. One where if we don't supply, an ally will supply, and the other one is if we don't supply, the Russians are coming. And they're going to move in and they're going to become the supplier, and we're going to have a reverse Ethiopia or Somalia or Egypt or all the places we can know where we've each been suppliers, and one moves out and one moves in. In the case of Saudi Arabia, I think that there is no more complicated part of the world than the Middle East. Not many, I think, would disagree with that. And we have what appear to be, I emphasize, conflicting foreign policy goals, and the transfers of sophisticated weaponry to either Israel or to any Arab state, in this case the Saudis, can further complicate that. So that we started off, I think we should start off with saying, is our arms transfers a part of foreign policy? And I think the problem we have in the Middle East is the determination of our foreign policy. Now, foreign policy can be complicated by an arms transfer. Let me just give you one case in point why I didn't think that sale should go forward. Forget all the questions about whether or not Israel is more or less secure, whether what it does, whether it will work, how much of an umbrella it presents, etc. It seems to me that the Saudis have been very deft at seeing to it that they give little more than lip service to involvement in any Mideast war up to now. They've essentially said to their Arab friends when they said, jump on with us, they've said, well, we'll send money, we wish you luck, we'll pray at the mosque for you, and so on. But now, it seems to me, because the interest we're looking to protect there is oil to the Western world and Japan, I mean, I think we can be fairly naked, we're in a situation where I think the sale of this sophisticated weaponry makes Saudi Arabia a valuable ally to the rest of the Arab world if there is confrontation. And failure to join the cause and engage that weaponry if confrontation occurs, I think will result in what is the most likely thing to occur, and that is internal espionage and sabotage, those wells being blown up by some of the 2 million Palestinians who run them now anyway. And the end result will be the foreign policy initiative we were setting out to protect, that is, free access to that oil, may very well be hindered instead of helped by the transfer.
General Scowcroft?
I wonder if that's really the case. First place, the Saudis have given token help before. It seems to me in the '67 war they sent a brigade or a battalion. I'm not sure it ever got there.
Yeah, it's only been token, that's the point.
That's right, they have done things. And I'm not sure that that would not be the case in any future conflict. As a matter of fact, I'd say the reverse would be true, that it would be involved mostly because the Israelis might feel it was vital to take out that AWACS in case a war started. I think that's, that's a possibility.
General, as a military planner, wouldn't you assume that if you were an Israeli planner? Wouldn't you assume if there's a war that those F-15s are not going to sit on a runway and those AWACS are not going to be just focused on the east and that you better hit first? I mean, you're a general. I mean, wouldn't you sit there and say that's the logical thing to do?
I would certainly make plans for it, but the Israelis have not hit all the Arab targets that they had the capability to hit in previous wars.
But none have had, as the ones they haven't hit, have not had the potential capability to wreak havoc on them that the weaponry we are now selling will and does. That's the only point.
That's true. But, but this may be a case which, in a sense, refutes your argument about the sophistication being an evil. In fact, it may be a benefit here because the equipment is so sophisticated, and that may be the case in a number of cases, that it cannot usefully be operated without American help, which gives us additional leverage to ensure, unlike M1 rifles and grenades and so on that they don't need any help for, gives us additional leverage in the way that those weapons will be used.
It seems to me that we completely ignore and look aside at the real issue, if we're talking about AWACS, and is how is it in our best interest, and what action should we take? We are almost governed. That's too strong a word, but the Israeli government and the supporters of Israel have an inordinate impact on our Congress, and that's really what we're not. The President has said is in the interest of the United States. Secretary Haig has said is in the interest. If you look to see the history of Saudi in the past few years and the friendship they have offered us, and I'm talking about OPEC now. OPEC was just trying to raise their price from $32 to $36 a barrel. It was the Saudis that kept them from doing that. They have done that on at least 3 different occasions. It was the Saudis that kept the Jordanians and others that wanted OPEC to go off the dollar standard onto another monetary exchange. So there have been any number of instances when we have been the beneficiary of the friendship of the Saudis. And for us to say that it's not in our interest to continue the friendship and to give them a defensive capability, and that's what we're talking about here, not with the F-15s, but in the AWACS, I think we're being particularly short-sighted, and I would certainly support it.
Well, yes.
You can't let it go by. I think that it's important that when you look at what the Saudis have done with oil prices, what they've done in the economic sphere, it's very clear that they have not done anything that is not out of line with their own self-interest.
Wait just a moment. Yeah. What about keeping the prices down? You think that would...
Absolutely, well, absolutely.
But all of the other nations have wanted to raise it.
That's right, but they perceived it in their own self-interest to keep the oil prices down. Because if the prices go up, the substitution for oil in the industrial West becomes quicker. Their resources of oil in the ground becomes obsolete quicker. But I don't think you can look at anything in the oil and the economic sphere and make a case that Saudi Arabia is doing us any favors. I mean, they may be doing us some favors as a byproduct of doing themselves some favors. What would be really impressive to me would be if they would throw their weight in behind the Camp David Accords. Now, that would be impressive. And in that case, that might change my view about things like sale of the F-15s to the AWACS.
All right,
and if I could just add one point, it seems to me we have another interest in the AWACS in Saudi Arabia, aside from what you've discussed, and that is a U.S. national interest to protect our own forces over there.
Right.
You know, we used to have long-range radar in Iran that could monitor the Soviet Union in any Soviet attack. Our battle fleets there are potentially very vulnerable.
That's right.
To Soviet air attack. And it seems to me that the AWACS serves a very important role and is right now in giving us early warning.
But General, you know better than I do. I just spent 2 days out at Tinker Air Force Base and spent all kinds of time in the Intelligence Committee. The AWACS flown within the boundaries of Saudi Arabia does not give us any warning that has anything comparable to that which in fact existed in Iran. We have a very limited ability, as broad as it is, to be able to detect whether or not there is a Soviet move, and it is really is not even remotely comparable to the Iranian
Absolutely,
position.
but it is a great deal better than the self-protection.
Right. And we have it now. We have 4 AWACS there. They are flying now. They're American crews. They're controlled by America, and they're
there at Saudi sufferance.
And Saudi needs them as much as we do.
Yeah. Well, I think we've gone into that. I'd like to come back to the fact that since '72, the Congress has, with some assertiveness, moved to try to reduce this issue of arms transfers. I wonder if the efforts of past administrations and the Congress have not produced a labyrinthine maze of administrative processes. Some elements of this program to go through state, the Defense Departments, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the individual services, the Treasury Department, the Agency for International Development, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Office of Management and Budget. And we constructed a system which is just incapable of flexible response to volatile and ever-changing worlds. Congress built a lot of these in initially. You were in the Congress actually through all this from '72 to '77 when all that legislation was going through. It doesn't work. I think we all seem to agree that
it doesn't work in the sense that arms sales have continued to increase. What we have done is, as you say, set up a rather elaborate procedure in which the Congress must approve, and you have got various players in the field. But once you set up a procedure like that, it's hard to be sure that the thing would have gone exactly the same without that procedure. Yes, Congress has never voted down an arms sales that has been proposed. Has an administration ever been dissuaded from proposing an arms sale because of this procedure and the fear that Congress might turn it down? You know, I think it's very hard to prove conclusively that it has been a total failure.
Could I suggest something less? That it seems to me that there are 2 reasons for the labyrinth, as you refer to it, that the Congress set up. One has been, I think, noticeably and unsuccessful, and one has been very successful. The first reason was that we hoped, everyone hoped, I think, that who was participated in it, that it would in fact cut down in terms of the gross quantity of weaponry and dollars represented in that weaponry that was transferred. to that extent, on a chart that you would draw and the dollars of weapon value transferred, it hasn't been very successful. But a second, and I believe more important reason why, and I was there from '72 on when we were doing this also in the Senate, was the foreign policy component of it. Because at the outset of this program, we all said, the one thing we all agree on, it is a tool of foreign policy. And what happened was we had presidents, Democrats and Republicans, over the previous 15 to 20, probably over our history, who were in fact treating what was viewed as an economic decision independent of the foreign policy consideration that the Congress said we now want to be part of. And to that extent, I think it's successful and has been successful in the sense, you may argue Congress wasn't right, but it's been successful and it accomplished what Congress set out to do, and that is be part of the game.
General Scowcroft?
I think Congress ought to be involved in these kinds of decisions. They are fundamentally foreign policy decisions. I think Congress really, and this is very difficult to do, ought to be involved at the policy stage, though. The problem I have with the present procedures is it's too late when you all get it. And you cannot reject a proposal of an administration without doing grievous foreign policy harm at that point.
Couldn't agree with you more.
That's the problem.
I think we've covered a lot of ground and perhaps raised a good number of questions among our friends in the audience. So it's time for the question and answer session. May I have the first question, please?
I'm Harry Freck from the Olin Corporation. I noticed all kinds of concerns and effects of arms transfers, but did not find anyone saying anything about the domestic effects, both economic and in our military preparedness. About 50% of our companies have been manufacturing goods for foreign sales, which is about the only thing that's kept our own industry alive in the defense products area.
All right, who'd like to start with that?
Well, I'll take it to start with, and you're exactly correct. Our arms sales has a very wide impact economically in this country. As a matter of fact, I was reading some, I don't know how authoritative it is, but some 50,000 families depended on the sales to Saudi Arabia alone in this proposed package. I don't know who put out that propaganda, but it is very, very wide. And I was just in a defense plant on the West Coast last week, and they were making armored personnel vehicles, and they don't have any sales to this country now. They're going to Spain, they're going to Israel, they're going to any number of other countries, but that's what's keeping them going, as you said. So it is a very broad. If we lost all our foreign military sales right now, the unemployment rate would go up substantially in this country.
General Scowcroft?
Well, I don't think there's any question that it is helpful to American industry and also to our own armed forces. It cuts substantially the unit cost of some of our equipment. But I'll be something of an iconoclast. I do not think that our arms sale policy ought to be dictated by our domestic economic needs. I think they ought to be dictated by our national interests and solely on that basis.
You ought also, one other point, minor point in this thing, and that is that yes, there are cases where we have sold arms abroad where there was no demand in the American armed forces for that equipment, so it did keep people at work. There are also cases, and probably more now if we're into a build-up phase in the U.S. military, where you've got competing claims where the U.S. military also wants the equipment and the arms sales are competing, and
yes.
You've got the question of who gets it first.
Like the F-16?
Yeah,
I
can think of a few. So it cuts both ways in that regard now.
That's true.
I would like to add one point, one additional point, and I think the gentleman's, the questioner's point is well taken. It does positively impact upon our balance of trade situation, but it is one of the potential upsides to arms sales. But to reiterate General Scowcroft's point, if in fact we have a circumstance where it becomes the motivating force behind the sale, not only have we sometimes not had in production military equipment that our military no longer needed, what we've tended to do is our arms merchants have decided to go sell what was also not needed by the third country, that particular weapon system. That has occurred too. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it has.
All right, next question, please.
Yes, my name is Bill Wickersham with the World Federalist Association. I would direct this to Congressman Aspin. Most of the panelists indicated that they think the United States should act in its own self-interest, which probably very few people would disagree. The question is, if 159 or so other nations around the world act in the same way, and if in fact the weaponry becomes more sophisticated and it becomes dispersed throughout the world, and if in fact, as several studies, including some United States government studies, suggest there will be nuclear capability within some 29 or 30 nations by, let's say, year 2000 for sure, how do we contain this so that it's not combustible and that the whole thing explodes?
That is a very good question. I think that the phenomenon that you're talking about is a very serious one and a very real one. If you look at the amount of money spent on arms in the world and just plot that over a number of years, it's really reaching staggering proportions. I'm not sure that you can stem that tide with an arms sales policy alone. If you had an across-the-board policy, which I think is unwise to take an extreme position of not selling anything to anybody no matter what, I think you would be making a not terribly significant dent on that race. I think the factors that go into arms races are factors that have to do with in national states, their rivalries with their neighbors, competing ideologies, competing religions, all of these things, and the impact of arms sales on that is a factor, but a relatively minor one, which, and I think that the problem is that people tend to look at arms sales as a good tool to stem that big race, and my problem is I don't think it will work, and you're putting an awful lot of weight on a very thin reed to try and accomplish it through arms sales. Through eliminating arms sales, sorry.
If I could just give one example. There's one case where we really tried to do this, and that was Latin America in the 1960s. The Alliance for Progress, we made a policy decision that we were not going to sell any arms, any sophisticated arms. We were not going to upgrade any of the equipment the Latin American countries had. It was a relatively stable period in Latin America. The competition between and among the countries was a low level. Most of their equipment, especially their airplanes, tanks, and so on, were obsolete. We stuck to that during almost all of the 60s. The result was that they bought arms from the British, bought arms from the French, and they bought arms from the Russians. And now, maybe in an ideal world, we could get together with our allies and even with the Russians, which the Carter administration tried, to put an end to that sort of thing. But as a practical matter, we don't have very much leverage.
May I, Mr. Wickersham, you implicit in your statement, at least as I heard it, was that there's an inconsistency between a transfer of arms, or potentially between U.S. self-interest and world harmony. And I would suggest that if that is part of your implicit in your statement, that is not correct. I think we're at a stage where one of my colleagues, Southern colleagues in the Senate, says it's wonderful when conscience and convenience cross paths. And I think in arms control policy, we have the opportunity to have both conscience and convenience cross paths. For example, you mentioned nuclear capability. That is the overwhelming concern for the entire world, it seems to me. And there are instances where arms transfer can diminish the prospect of the feeling of urgency to develop and or steal and or whatever a nuclear capability. And conversely, there are cases, which I believe is a situation potentially in Pakistan, where massive arms transfers can propel the competing countries in the region to move toward the greater reliance on nuclear. So it can work to the benefit on occasion, but that's what I meant by I think we should do it case by case.
Next question, please.
My name is Richard Darilek. I'm currently an International Affairs Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. I actually have two questions. They're interrelated. The first is, if memory serves correct, the biggest market, the biggest business market that the United States has in the world for its arms sales policies is, in fact, our allied market, and principally our NATO allied market. That's where most of the sales go on. Yet, on the other hand, as I understand it, NATO has various policies itself to which we subscribe, policies like rationalization, standardization, interoperability, one implication of which is that the Allies should be able to sell us more. They have learned the domestic effects and the business benefits of arms sales themselves in the inter-allied arena, and they like to oftentimes get in on the act. That creates, however, a certain tension between a U.S. policy, which is promoting sales to the alliance, and an allied policy which wants reciprocity. And my first question then is, how do we resolve this tension, and is there room excuse me, for a new policy in this general area? My second question arises from something I think Senator Biden said earlier, and that was the suggestion that sometimes allied arms sales abroad are not necessarily detrimental to us, and they might sometimes be encouraged. I wondered, when he made that remark, whether or not this in general, allied sales abroad don't serve as a kind of safety valve in some ways for the tension in NATO, the tension I described earlier. And I'm wondering if we have a U.S. policy that on the one hand either tries to control those sales more tightly, as some have ascribed to the previous administration, or a policy that tries to promote American arms sales abroad more vociferously, particularly if you use an anti-allied argument. If they don't sell it, we will. If we don't sell it, they will. In the process, I wonder if, in this respect, we don't run the risk of cutting down or shortchanging the safety valve aspects of things, and in fact, perhaps endangering the larger NATO allied market, which is where the real money, if you will, often comes into play.
Senator Biden?
I think you're absolutely correct. You pose the problem in a very articulate manner. I think we get back to the fundamental question. What is our foreign policy, and what should NATO be? How should it be made up, and how effective is it? And part of the question of whether or not it's effective relates to the interoperability, the standardization. Standardization is not merely motivated. It is not primarily motivated by the requirement of the French to get in on the deal. It's motivated by the question that generals know better than senators, and that is, how do you have a unified battle plan without having radios that can receive one another's messages, without having spare parts that can be interchanged, without having tanks and planes and guns, etc., that can be used under a unified command, somewhat like a unified army. And that is the motivating factor. Now, once we reach that decision, I think the Allies have a right to say, hey, wait a minute. Now, you ain't getting it all. We want a piece of that. And I think that we have to be willing to make that decision. There is a great deal of pressure from our domestic arms manufacturers to say no, that we don't want you, quote, giving away any of our piece of the market. I think, just as we've done in many other areas of foreign relations, we have to have the courage or the foresight to say, we're going to figure out what component, what portion you're going to make up, United States, what piece we're willing to take. Absent that, there is a great risk being run in cutting off the safety valve. You are absolutely correct, because that's part of that's part of the plan. I believe because we haven't been willing to follow through on what is clearly in our strategic and conventional interest to do, that is standardized. And the reason we haven't been able to do it is in large part is because of the economic decisions involved in it. Because of that, we have propelled to a greater degree our allies into markets that compete with us in the third world, and in many instances force us to make decisions that are marginally less detrimental than if we didn't move into the area. I think you stated very well.
General Scowcroft?
I agree with the senator, but I think what we need to work on is the NATO part rather than the safety valve part, because
I agree.
NATO spends more than the Warsaw Pact does on arms, and yet we're woefully behind in preparedness. One of the reasons is that each country goes out and builds its own little system. They don't work together, they're not standardized and so on. We're one of the biggest culprits, not only for economic reasons, but military. Our own military tend to think that unless it's our equipment, it's not good enough, and we have worldwide concerns, not just in NATO, and therefore we have to have our own unique equipment. I think we need to do far more than that, and we need to take the lead.
Representative Dickinson?
I don't disagree with what has been said. I thought maybe it would perhaps be helpful to put it in a little different context. For the past few years, I've been a delegate to the North Atlantic Alliance, or Assembly. And the question comes up there as an economic section, a political section, and a military section, and I'm on the military section. And this question comes up every time we meet. If we met 6 times a year, that's how many times it would come up. This two-way street, the RSI. And one of the things that causes the breakdown is that our NATO allies say, well, look, we're buying more weapons from you than you're buying from us, and so it's not fair. And the American reply is, well, look, you're not counting the cost of us stationing our troops in Europe. And if you put in the cost of what we're spending to station our troops in Europe to defend you, we're spending more than you're spending. So it goes round and round. But I think in the final analysis for your major systems, that I think the answer is going to have to be what we did with the F-16. That is, you're going to break down, and everybody that wants to get in on the act, all the countries, they make components. And General Dynamics is making part here, and Belgium is making part there. And it seems to be working pretty well. And rather than saying, well, we'll build this airplane and you build that tank and we'll swap out. So I think that down the road we're going to find that's probably the most practical way to go.
All right, next question. Next question, please.
I'm Major Bill Hudson. I'm a U.S. Air Force Research Associate at Advanced International Studies Institute. Congressman Aspin indicated earlier he felt that arms sales or arms transfers actually had perhaps very little leverage. This seems to be the substance of what the panel discussion is about. I wonder if you could all reply concretely to the fact or to the opinion. Do you think that arms transfers compare favorably to other foreign policy tools, diplomatic or economic, in achieving concrete results, such as basing rights, or more generally, leverage or influence?
You want to start?
Yeah, let me say, I think that what I meant was that I think leverage is very often overstated, and it's easy to anticipate a lot of leverage when, in fact, the leverage may not be very great. And I can think of some examples. One of the arguments is that arms sales give us some control over the use of that weapons, because if you keep control over the ammunition and the spare parts, you're then going to have some the country a little bit on a leash as to whether the stuff gets used or not. But there are military engagements in which you don't use up a lot of ammunition and spare parts. Israel bombed the Iraqi reactor, one swift blow, and you may have all the control over ammunition and spare parts, and it doesn't give you much leverage. Also, countries have a way of building up enough consumables. I think the Shah of Iran set about a particular policy of trying to actually build up enough consumables of ammunition and spare parts for the very purpose of shaking loose and getting a little bit more flexibility. I mean, in the old days, back in the 50s, we seemed to have a lot of leverage. But back in the 50s, there was more than arms sales. We were also giving economic grants and all kinds of other economic aid. And the Russians were nowhere near as omnipresent as they are now. And so we had a great deal of influence. But I think people look back on that and think that the arms sales gave us leverage, when in fact it was a whole constellation of aid and assistance and underwriting them financially which gave us the leverage. Leverage is a point, but I think it's very often overstated in the arguments when it comes down to a particular arms sale.
Anybody want to add anything to that?
Slightly more than food through peace, slightly less than technology.
Well, I think the issue is more complicated than influence. If by influence you mean we're buying influence by selling arms, and that therefore they'll do what we want, I think the answer is clearly no. But it's a much more subtle kind of an influence. Theoretically, it helps these people with their own purposes. It gives them a certain amount of self-confidence. In some cases, it's vital to preserving the military balance. You take countries like Korea, for example. Were we to shut Korea off, you know, the results could clearly be disaster. North Korea gives every indication that if they thought they could succeed, they would attack. Turkey is another case where a clear military necessity. Others are political. But I think you can't just look at cause and effect. I think it's much more subtle. And as Congressman Aspin said earlier, in many cases the influence is purely negative, and that is if you don't do it, you really disrupt your foreign policy.
Let me give one small example of what the general is saying, I think. In the School of the Americas, which is run in Panama to train military officers from Latin American countries, and in this country, our National War College, Air War College, all the services have them, we bring in foreign students, and they're the cream of the crop from that country. And the cultural exchange and the one-on-one relationship that are developed then have very long-lasting, because these are the people who will ultimately be in the leadership of those countries. And so that's a dividend that you can't overlook that most people really seem to be unaware of.
Well, I very much regret, but our time has run out, and this concludes another Public Policy Forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our hearty thanks to the expert panelists, General Brent Scowcroft, Representative William L. Dickinson, Senator Joseph R. Biden, Jr., and Representative Les Aspin, and our thanks also to our guests and experts in the audience for their participation. Goodbye from Washington.
It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by doing so, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, publicly supported research and education organization. Information on this and other subject areas, including government regulation, economic policy, social security and retirement, health policy, legal policy, tax policy, political and social processes, energy policy, defense policy, and international affairs is available from the Institute. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.